Hey guys, what's up? Hope you're doing good. And what we're going to be looking at in this video is test-driven development, unit testing. The examples I'm going to be providing are in C Sharp, but this also applies to JavaScript or any sort of other programming language that you're using. If you're new to programming, just getting involved, this is something that is going to be difficult for you to grasp. It's something that is completely different than just pounding out code in a procedural manner or even an object-oriented manner. Unit testing is all about isolating dependencies in order to actually be able to isolate, just one particular chunk of your code so that the dependencies itself don't cause the code to break. And you can test the logic inside that code base without ever having to worry about database connections or reaching across the web or something like that. Because anytime you have to do something like that, then it no longer becomes a unit test. It becomes an end-to-end test where you're testing two different services that are communicating with each other, and that's known as an integration test, and that's not a unit test. In C Sharp, there's a project out there called MOQ, and MOQ is a free project that you can install using NuGet, but it's all about making it easier on you to mock up any sort of dependencies that any particular piece of code that you're testing has. So every code, anytime you have a complicated project, dependencies are always going to crop up. And finding out, ways to have been able to mock up those dependencies is very, very difficult. MOQ makes it easier, and we're going to look at how to do that. So let me go ahead and just give a background of this example code. I did not want to actually have all of this in the tutorial where I'm creating all this code because it is just kind of boilerplate. It's basic level code out here, but what we have is a simple band class, right? So there's just 4 strings, nothing big, name, origin, genre, best song. And then we have a band controller. Now this controller class is going to be the object that we're going to test. So this is where we run into a problem in the real world. And this is just a small example, but things get way out of control when you start dealing with complex systems, especially in the enterprise world. This band controller class has a repository, which is an interface. And so it takes in an object that implements this interface. Now, if you know C Sharp, then you know that you can instantiate an object from an interface. It's just a contract that classes use in order to fulfill, but the classes themselves are the ones that actually implement what is called concrete objects from the contract interface. So hopefully I didn't just lose you there if you don't know C Sharp, but if you do know C Sharp, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But this is just an interface, and if we look at the interface file, it has one method, which it returns a list of band objects. So we've already looked at what a band object is. And this implementation has a class that implements it. So this is the actual concrete class that implements the interface, and then it fulfills the contract by creating that get bands method, which returns a list of bands. So it's returning 3 bands. Now, in a repository isn't really going to return static content like this, right? This is just an example. Typically what your repository does, it acts as a middleman to reach out to a database, to reach out to some sort of RESTful service, and it's responsible for that two-way communication, both passing data to these services and also getting data back from these services. In this example, this is just simply returning 3 static band objects as a list of bands, but we're going to pretend, and that's why I have this comment here, we're going to pretend that this thing calls out to a database. So there's our concrete implementation of the iRepository contract. And then you have, this is a typo here. So then you have, since this is just a simple console application, the static main method is just building a concrete class or concrete object from this concrete class. And then it actually also creates we'll call this, instead of example, we'll just call this band controller, since that's what it's doing. It's newing up a band controller, and then it passes in the concrete implementation of the repository. which is needed. So if we look at the band controller, you can see this is where the dependency comes in. This is where unit testing gets difficult, especially when you have a lot of classes like this that need to be mocked up. So you can see here that this thing says that I need a repository object to be passed in, and that's what's going on here. It's creating the repository object and it's passing it in so that it can create it. Now in a unit test, we do not want that to happen because we have to pretend that this concrete repository here is going to be calling out to databases and things like that, and we don't want that. We want that to be isolated. Our unit test, if it relies upon that, is going to be subject to failure for things that are out of its control. Then you're no longer, like I said, doing unit tests. You're looking at more of an end-to-end type of test. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at how we add a testing project to our C# solution. So here is our solution. If we want to add a unit test project, we just simply right-click on the solution itself, go to Add, say New Project, go down to Test. We're going to do a unit test project. We can just call it whatever sort of name it wants to give it, which is Unit Test Project 1. Click OK. This is going to add a project to the solution. And this unit test project needs to be able to access the code in MOQ example, which is the name of the main project. And it needs that code, otherwise we wouldn't be able to test it. So in order for a unit test project to be able to access that code, we need to go to its references, and we're going to say add reference. And over here we want to click on projects and solution, and then you can see that it has MOQ example. So we're just going to check that and click OK. Now the unit test is going to have access to all this code in here so that we can start testing it. Let's give this unit test 1 that was created for us, which is a test class file. We want to rename that to something meaningful. Since we're going to be testing band controller, we're going to actually, and this is the normal procedure that I've seen, is that you actually name the test file, whatever sort of thing that you're testing, whatever class you're testing, you're going to give it the same name, except you're going to put test on the end. So we went ahead and we renamed this to band controller test. Now this test class and test method, this is all just built-in stuff for C# and Visual Studio in order to make it easier for you to be able to test. And we're going to make use of that. But for right now, let's go ahead and create a test method for our band controller, which is what we're testing. And we have this method to test. And I want to copy that because we're going to go into the band controller test and we're going to change this method name to method to test so it's clear what we're testing. And in our test file, in order for this thing to work, we need to be able to say variable controller. In fact, I'll call this band controller to be specific, equals new controller. Well, actually band controller, I'm sorry. Band controller, not test, but band controller. So it's going to say it can't find it. So we need to actually say using MOQ example. So it'll add the using statement at the top. And now we can access. So if I do an F12 on this object, you can see it actually points to the right project and the right band controller. So let me go back. Now you can see that it's saying you can't new this object up because you haven't passed in the right data to the constructor. The constructor here needs a class that implements the iRepository interface. So this is where we run into a problem when you try to isolate something, because you can't just simply say variable repository repository equals new repository. Now you could do that, but the problem with this, and I could just simply now pass in repository, right? And now it's satisfied and I can new up my band controller. But the problem is here, and what we're pretending is that, and in most situations, when we look at repository, this is returning static data, but we have to pretend that it's actually connecting to a database or calling a downstream service. And if it does that in order to return data, we do not want that to happen, because if that service goes down that it's interfacing to, then your test is going to fail, and it has nothing to do with the test that you're actually trying to test. You know what I mean? It has to do with an external dependency, and that's where MOQ comes into play. So we don't want to do this. This isn't going to work for us. It's a complete no-no in unit testing. So that's where MOQ comes into play. And MOQ, like I said, is a free library. And if we go to, let's see, NuGet, and we could see NuGet library. So here's this. NuGet is a real big piece of shit, by the way, compared to some of the other package managers that I've seen, like npm or pip. Or I mean, it seems like NuGet fails on me all the time. In fact, it's one of the primary sources of frustration that I have in enterprise development is having to deal with it. But anyway, hopefully it's going to work here. So let's go ahead and pull this join up. So now let's go over to our tools and say NuGet package manager, and we'll just go to the console. That'll work. And we have to wait for PowerShell and all that stuff to fire up here. All right, finally, that took forever. So now we're just going to paste in install package MOQ. It's actually going to... You know what, we're not going to do that because that's actually going to put it in our main project. Don't do that. So let's go over to our references here. And we can just say manage NuGet packages. And we want to do that in our unit test project. Make sure you're doing that in the unit test project and not the MOQ example, assuming you're following along. So we'll say manage NuGet packages. And here I can go ahead and search. I don't need to do all that, but I can search MOQ. And here's MOQ, so I can go ahead and click on that, click install, and click OK. All right, so now you can see MOQ is now being referenced, so we have it installed. That's good. Now this is where we're going to go ahead and use MOQ to instantiate this iRepository object. So all we need to do is say mock, and then whatever it is that we're actually implementing. So we'll say iRepository, and then we have to give it a name. So typically you'll say like mock repository or whatever, whatever sort of object you're mocking up. You just simply say mock and then whatever the object name is. So we'll say new repository. And this needs to say mock as well. Now this actually, so you need to add the using statement using MOQ. That doesn't need to be repository. That should just be repository like that. All right, there we go. So now we have a completely mocked up object here using MOQ. And in order to be able to pass it in, we can't just simply say mock repository like we did before, because you can see if we highlight over it that we're actually, this is a see, look, you cannot convert from MOQ mock to MOQ example iRepository. So that's not going to, so what you need to do anytime you're dealing with a mocked object, you need to say dot object. And now this will work. So if we went ahead and let's just do we're going to add one more project to our unit test. Go ahead and right click and we're going to say manage NuGet packages again. And one helpful thing to deal with anytime you're trying to do assertions is fluent assertions. And here it is, right? Oh, shit. Damn it. All right, so here's fluid assertions. Go ahead and add that. All right. Is it in there yet? There it is. Yeah, so now it's in there. All right, so now it's always a lot easier to be like this. So band controller dot should. I need to using fluent assertions. We'll say dot should dot We'll just say not be null. Dot should dot not be null. So this makes it a little bit easier to unit test. And let's go ahead and put a breakpoint right here. So if I right click on this this test method, you can see Visual Studio gives you the option to debug test. So we're going to do that now. And you can see down here it's building and it's kind of slow. It's actually very slow, especially when you start getting like 25, 30,000 tests in a solution. It gets ridiculously slow. All right, so now we hit our breakpoint, and you can see that we were able to successfully instantiate a band controller object using a mocked up dependency. So instead of actually, you can see that this is the mocked object and everything. So assuming you pass this in, anything that band controller does to call out using that repository is actually, they're not going to make those calls because it's a mocked up object. So what we need to do, and you can see band controller should not be null, so it won't be null. It'll pass the test, and you'll get a little green check marks because the test passed. So let's look at our band controller again. If you look at the band controller and the method to test, it says this.repository.getBands. So let's put a breakpoint before the for each because we want to see what happens with bands. And if we run this unit test again, so since we put a breakpoint on this for each method, or right on this for each statement in our method to test, we need to actually go ahead with our band object in our test here. We're going to say band controller. Dang it. So the band controller dot, and then the method to test. So method to test. So we're going to execute that. And now if I right click and we say debug test, it's going to hit the breakpoint in band controller. So here we hit the breakpoint, but you can see bands is null. And the reason why it's null is because our repository isn't the real deal repository that reaches out to the database or the RESTful service or wherever it is that it gets its data, because we don't want it to, because then it would be, like I said, an integration test and not a unit test. So that being said, we need to use MOQ. Let's stop this test. We need to use MOQ to say when you get called out to get bands, you need to go ahead and return something. So what I would do is I would go something like this. So you say mock repository. So after your instantiation statement here, you're going to say setup, and then you use a lambda where we could say like x dot, and this is where we'll say get bands, and then we tell it to return get bands dot returns. And because this is a method, you actually need to have an open and close parenthesis there, and this should be capital returns. So this is going to return a new list of band. In fact, really what you would probably want to do is just say list of bands, and we'll go ahead and create that list of bands object. So this is where we would actually go ahead and create our dependency. So we'll say create list of bands to return, and this is where we can say variable list of bands equals new list of band. Let's make sure we're requiring, so using, all right, now we can go ahead and add to the list of bands, new band, and then here's where we're actually passing in, so we'll say name equals Bayside, origin, Queens, New York. genre equals alternative. And then best song equals I and I. This is all subjective, by the way. So here we have this list of bands which we created. So we're basically saying, hey, under a normal situation, repository would return this, but since repository is mocked, we actually need to specifically say, return this expected data. And then we take the mocked object and then we use this setup. And by using a lambda, we're able to say when request bands or get bands is called, return this mocked up list of bands that I've just created inside of my test. So now if we run this unit test, and instead of the list of bands returning null, it's going to return a list of bands with just that one band that we just added Bayside. Or it's actually not, because we have an issue here. So this is actually good that we ran into this issue, because this is something that will probably trip you up as well. See, we're actually mocking up the concrete repository implementation, when instead we should just be mocking up the interface. And that's one of the reasons why we use interface and interface injection, because interfaces allow us to build mocked objects from those interfaces, and it makes things a lot more flexible than having to mock up actual concrete implementation. So let's go ahead and just change this over to iRepository. So by switching that over to the iRepository, if we were to now run the same test over again, let's right click, debug test. And now if we look at bands, instead of it returning null, we can see it actually returns 1. So now it's returning the exact mocked up data that we just provided it. And our test can go ahead and proceed, with this data, which is completely mocked and completely isolated, without ever having to worry about having to reach out and have network connection problems and stuff like that could cause our unit test to fail. All right, so I'm probably going to do some additional videos in MOQ. I'm kind of curious if you guys will even embrace that or not. This was more of an example of why you would want to do unit testing and why it's important to use mocking frameworks. If you've ever done unit testing in JavaScript, there's a framework that you'll probably hear a lot about if you never used it before, but it's called Jasmine. And Jasmine is a JavaScript way of, similar to MOQ with C# for being able to mock up and be able to spy on tests and things like that. MOQ is almost like like how jQuery is a library and there's all this semantic syntax and stuff that you have to follow, and rules and things for chaining functions together and what you can and can't do. MOQ has a lot of complications in the different ways that it can actually monitor arguments being passed in, whether or not methods were called, and things like that. This is typically what you're going to end up doing a lot, as far as having to use MOQ to mock up implementations and things like that in order for your test to pass. So let me know if you guys are interested in having me explain more into MOQ, because I'd be happy to do that. But if nobody's going to really embrace that or watch the video, I don't feel like dealing with it, to be honest with you, because I have to do it a lot at work anyway. But anyway, guys, this video was all about how you can get unit testing and why unit testing is important, and the difference between unit testing and regression testing. And also just a quick example on how to actually get MOQ working with Visual Studio and your C# project. All right, guys, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Please upvote. Please share. And I appreciate all the support. Have a good day. Bye.